My boyfriend broke up with me and said he didn't love me anymore, but he still wanted to keep living with me so he wouldn't have to pay rent. Brenna isn't even my kind of name, if I'm being honest, but it's the one on my mailbox and my paychecks and the lease I thought would protect me, so I guess it's mine now. I'm telling you this because people love to act like these stories start with some dramatic bang. Mine didn't. Mine started the way most disasters start, with a tiny compromise that feels kind and reasonable and temporary. Then you blink and realize you've been carrying somebody else for so long you forgot what it's like to stand straight. This happened in the United States, in my apartment. So, picture this. I'm a software developer at a mid-sized office where the carpet always smells like old coffee, and the break room has exactly one working microwave. And I met my boyfriend when he still had a steady job at a creative agency, the kind of place where people act like being busy is a personality trait. He wasn't flashy, which is what got me, because I'd dated flashy before, and it always came with surprise bills and I'll pay you back that turned into dust. He had his own apartment, paid his own stuff, kept his own life together, and when we started dating, it felt balanced. Like we were two adults choosing each other instead of one adult adopting the other. For the first couple of years, it was genuinely good. In that normal way where you're still learning each other's routines, and you still say thank you for small things. We split dates, we traded cooking nights, we complained about work the way everyone does, and when he'd come over with groceries, he actually bought groceries instead of showing up with 2 fancy snacks and calling it helping. I liked that he didn't need me, and I liked that I didn't need him. And I swear I thought that meant we'd always choose each other freely. Yes, I know how that sounds now. Let me live in my delusion for a second. Then the agency downsized, and he got laid off. And I remember the exact way his face looked when he told me. Because it was that specific mix of embarrassment and anger that makes you want to comfort someone and also back away a little, like you're near a stove and you're not sure if it's hot. He tried to play it cool, like, it's fine, I'll freelance for a bit. And I believed him because the version of him I knew always landed on his feet. A few weeks after that, he started hinting about his rent. And by hinting, I mean he'd casually mention how wild it was that prices were going up, and how his savings were getting eaten alive, and how his landlord didn't care about real people. And I did that thing women do where we hear a problem and we immediately start solving it, like it's our job to keep the air in the room breathable. He suggested he could stay with me for a little while until he got stable again, and I remember saying yes like it was nothing, like it wasn't a door opening, because my lease was only in my name and I figured that meant control. Spoiler. Control is a cute word landlords invented. At first, it really did look temporary. He moved in with 2 suitcases and his computer, and he gave me money for his share, and he cooked a few times, and he acted grateful. We even joked about how we were playing house, and which is funny, because what we were actually doing was setting up a situation where he'd be comfortable and I'd be responsible. I didn't see it then. I just felt like a good girlfriend, the kind people brag about having, which honestly should have made me suspicious right away because whenever someone praises you for being understanding, they usually mean easy to use. Before all of that blew up, there were signs I ignored because they didn't look like red flags. They looked like normal stress, and I was tired enough to confuse the two. Like, he started sleeping later and later, and he'd say it was because he worked better at night. But night work was mostly him watching videos and researching, which is the adult version of procrastinating while sounding important. He'd promise he was sending applications all day, and then I'd walk out of my home office to grab water and he'd be in the kitchen scrolling on his phone, telling me, I'm taking a quick break. Like his whole life was one long break with small interruptions of effort. I also started doing this embarrassing thing where I'd preemptively soothe his ego. Like I'd choose my words carefully so he wouldn't feel attacked. Because when he felt attacked, he'd get sulky and moody, and the apartment would feel cold. I'd say, maybe you could try, instead of, you need to. And I'd say, it might help, instead of, this is necessary. And I'd soften everything until my own needs sounded like suggestions. And when you make your needs sound optional long enough, people start treating them like they are. There were little fights that didn't resolve, just faded until the next one. Like when I asked him to stop leaving dirty dishes to soak overnight, and he said I was obsessed with cleanliness. Or when I asked him to keep the volume down when he played games late, and he said I was controlling. Or when I asked him to stop inviting people over without asking me first, and he said, it's my home too. And I remember that phrase landing in my brain like a pebble, because part of me wanted to say, then pay like it is, but I didn't. Because I still thought we were a couple and couples don't talk like landlords. My friends noticed more than I admitted. One friend asked me why I was always tired, and I joked about work, and she stared at me and said, no, it's not just work. And I laughed it off, because if I said the truth out loud, it would have become real. Another friend came over and watched him talk over me, and later she texted, "He's kind of intense." And I replied with the classic, "He's just stressed." Like stress is a get-out-of-being-decent card. The worst part was how normal it all seemed in the moment. You don't wake up one day and think, "Today, I'm going to financially support a man who will later call me a roommate." It happens in tiny steps. You pay one bill because he's short. You buy extra groceries because he's hungry. You cover a dinner because you don't want to embarrass him. You stop asking for money because you don't want to fight. You start telling yourself love means patience. And then you realize patience is just another word for staying quiet while someone takes. I remember one specific night, months before the breakup conversation, when we were at a small restaurant with friends and the check came, and he didn't even reach for it. He just looked at me like it was my turn, like it was obvious. I paid, and on the drive home I asked him, gently, if he could contribute a little more consistently, and he got quiet and then he snapped, saying I was making him feel small. That's when I realized money conversations with him weren't about money. They were about ego. And you can't budget around someone's ego, because it's never satisfied. I wish I could tell you I left right then, like some empowered heroine, but I didn't. I went home, I apologized for making him feel bad, and I told myself I'd bring it up later when he was in a better mood. That later is how you lose years. By the way, by the time his little while turned into several months, I'd stopped checking the calendar because it started making me anxious. Like every date was a reminder that time was moving and he wasn't. His freelancing happened in bursts. Little projects that made him feel important for a week and then went quiet again. And each quiet stretch came with a new explanation, a new reason the world was unfair to him, a new story about how clients were flaky or the market was weird. Meanwhile, my job was still my job, which meant morning meetings, deadlines, and that constant low-level stress that sits under your ribs like a trapped animal. The first real shift was subtle, which is what makes it dangerous because you can't point to one moment and say, that's when it changed. His contributions got smaller, and the way he handed me money got more casual, like it was something he was doing as a favor instead of something he owed. He'd say, "I'll get you next week." And I'd say, "Sure," because I didn't want to sound like a landlord. Yes, I hate myself for that sentence too. Then his next week turned into soon, and his soon turned into silence. And suddenly I was paying the rent and the utilities and the groceries because the refrigerator doesn't care about pride. I added his car to my insurance because he'd said his rate would be higher alone, and he said it like he was doing math for the team, like we were strategic partners. And I nodded because, again, I didn't want to be the kind of girlfriend who keeps score. I put his phone on my plan because it's cheaper together, and I told myself it was just temporary. And the whole time I was saying temporary, my bank account was quietly screaming. I started buying groceries alone because if I asked him to come with me, he'd wander off and pick out the most expensive things like he was on a game show, and I didn't have the energy to argue over cereal. And it's not like he sat on the couch doing nothing all day, not exactly, because he'd do just enough productive stuff to look busy, like editing his portfolio, watching tutorials, reorganizing his files, making calls that sounded like work but were mostly him complaining. Sometimes he'd clean the kitchen in a dramatic burst and then act like he deserved a medal. And I'd say thank you, because if you don't say thank you, they call you ungrateful. It was this constant balancing act, where I was trying to be supportive without becoming a doormat. And somehow I did both. We still had good moments, which is what kept me trapped in the mental math. We'd watch shows together, we'd cook together, we'd laugh, we'd have sex, we'd talk about the future in that vague way people do when they want to feel hopeful without making promises. From the outside, we looked fine. My friends would say, "You're so patient," and I'd smile like I wasn't quietly keeping track of how much patience cost per month. Then he started acting like my apartment was his apartment, like the space belonged to him simply because his body was in it. He'd invite friends over without asking. He'd offer them drinks I'd bought. He'd make plans in our living room like he was hosting, and I'd stand there with my laptop bag still on my shoulder, listening to him laugh loudly while my brain did that tired little whisper, "This isn't balanced anymore." One night, he asked me to make a dinner reservation for him and his friends, and he said it like it was normal, like I was his assistant, and I remember pausing with my phone in my hand, feeling this stupid heat rise in my face. I asked why he couldn't do it, and he shrugged and said, "You're better at that stuff." Which sounds harmless until you realize better at that stuff is what people say when they want you to do labor for free. I still made the reservation. Don't clap for me. I'm already mad. By month 6 of him living with me, my sleep got weird. Not in a cute, I'm staying up too late scrolling way, but in that heavy, stressed way where your body is tired and your mind is doing inventory, like it's counting cans in a bunker. I'd lie awake thinking about rent, about how my savings weren't growing anymore, about how I was paying for someone who kept talking about getting back on track, like it was a train that might eventually arrive if he just stared at the tracks long enough. I tried to talk to him a few times, gently at first, because I was still in the supportive partner costume. I'd say things like, "Hey, can we make a plan?" And he'd nod and say yes, and then get defensive the moment I asked for specifics. He'd say, "I'm trying." And I'd say, "I know." And I'd swallow the part where I wanted to scream, "Trying isn't a payment method." And that's the thing nobody tells you about being a woman in a relationship with a struggling man. You're supposed to hold him up emotionally while he figures himself out. But the second you need support back, you're being unreasonable. Your job is to be the stable one, the understanding one, the one who doesn't crack under pressure. His job is just to exist and occasionally feel bad about it. The worst part is I started adjusting my own life to make his comfort easier, like I was slowly moving furniture in my head to fit him better. I stopped buying little things for myself. No random coffee shop treat, no new shoes, no small weekend trips, because I didn't want to feel guilty when he couldn't. I told myself we were a team. But if you're a team and only one person is running, that's not a team. That's someone carrying someone else like a backpack with opinions. He kept his pride, though, which was impressive in a rage-inducing way. He'd talk about how he could get a job anywhere, but he didn't want to settle. And he said it like settling was a moral failure. Like taking a smaller job would make him less of a person. Meanwhile, my job wasn't glamorous either. It was just work. And I did it because rent doesn't accept potential as currency. And then, on a random night that was so boring it felt safe, we were sitting on the couch watching some show I barely cared about, and he muted the TV and said he wanted to talk. That tone is like a dog whistle for dread, because you know it's never about something small. He started with this whole, "I respect you so much" thing, and my stomach dropped because respect is what people say right before they hurt you. He told me he didn't feel romantic love for me anymore, and he said it like he was reporting weather. Like, "Hey, it might rain tomorrow." Just neutral, factual, detached. He said he cared about me as a person, that I was his best friend, that he didn't want to lose our connection. And then he hit me with the part that made my brain go staticky. He wanted us to keep living together as roommates. Just roommates. No romance, no expectations, but still sharing the apartment because it worked. He wanted roommates in words, but girlfriend privileges in practice, whenever it was convenient. I stared at him, and I swear my body had that weird frozen feeling, like if I moved, I'd shatter. I asked if he was breaking up with me, and he did this little sigh and said, "I don't want labels. I just want honesty." Which, again, sounds mature, until you realize it's a way to avoid responsibility while keeping access. I felt humiliated in this very specific way, like someone had been laughing at me quietly for months and I'd finally heard it. Because the math in my head did not take long. He didn't love me, but he loved my apartment, my grocery runs, my insurance coverage, my stability. He loved the life I built, not me. I didn't scream right away. I didn't throw anything. I didn't do anything cinematic. I just sat there and said, "I need time." And then I went into the bedroom and closed the door. And I stood in the dark like an idiot, holding my phone, shaking, because I didn't know who to call without sounding pathetic. And yes, I did end up calling nobody and just spiraling alone, like a champion. I barely slept. And when the sun came up, I went for a walk because if I stayed in the apartment, I thought I might explode. I walked around my neighborhood with that numb, tight feeling in my chest, and I kept replaying his words, especially the way he said roommates, like it was a solution. When I got back, I tried to talk again, and he acted like I was overreacting, like my pain was an inconvenience. He said, "Don't make this dramatic." And I swear something in me snapped quietly, like a rubber band finally giving up. And then he said this thing that I still hear sometimes when I'm tired. He told me I'd always been better as a partner in life than as a woman, like I was a useful appliance he'd grown bored of. I locked myself in the bathroom and cried so hard my face went numb, and I remember thinking, this is what it feels like to be reduced to function. Later that day, I saw notifications pop up on our shared tablet in the living room, and I didn't even mean to snoop. But the screen lit up with his messages like it wanted me to see. He was in a group chat with his friends, telling them he'd finally been honest. And they were praising him, calling him brave, calling him mature, acting like he'd just rescued a puppy instead of gutting his girlfriend. I sat there on the floor, staring at those messages, and all I could think was, oh, he rehearsed this, he planned to keep the benefits, and he wanted applause for it. That's when I made my first real decision, and it wasn't noble, it wasn't calm, it wasn't graceful. I decided, fine, you want roommates? You're getting roommates. And I'm going to stop doing girlfriend labor like it's a subscription you can cancel when you're bored. The week he asked for the roommates thing, I did something I'm still embarrassed about. I read articles online about staying friends after a breakup, like I was studying for an exam I didn't want to take. I sat in bed at midnight, my face puffy from crying, scrolling through advice that sounded like it was written by people who've never had their rent held hostage by their feelings. Everything was about communication and mutual respect, and I remember thinking, okay, but what if one person wants respect and the other wants free housing? Where's the article for that? I tried to be rational for about a day, and then I had a full spiral. I looked at our old photos on my phone, which is something nobody should do when they're already in pain, and I caught myself zooming in on his face like I could find a clue in pixels. I reread texts from months ago, trying to pinpoint when his love supposedly disappeared, and all I found was me being supportive and him being comfortable. I wrote a long message I never sent, basically begging him to be honest about whether he'd been using me, and then I deleted it because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me plead. I also did that thing where you rehearse arguments in your head in the shower, and you win every time, and then you step out and face the real person, and suddenly your voice disappears. One morning, I stood in the kitchen with my coffee, and he walked in, yawning, acting casual, and I wanted to say, "You broke me," but what came out was, "Do you want the last of the milk?" Because apparently my trauma response is hospitality. Please laugh with me, because otherwise I'll scream. When I finally started enforcing roommate rules, it wasn't because I was brave, it was because I was exhausted. There's a point where your body can't keep performing softness. My shoulders were tense all the time. My stomach hurt. I was snapping at coworkers. I cried in my car after work more times than I can count. I started realizing that if I stayed in that apartment with him under any version of roommates, I'd slowly rot, and nobody would notice because from the outside it would look civil. He kept trying to rewrite what was happening. Every boundary I set was punishment, every no was me being cold, and every consequence was somehow my fault. He wanted honesty to mean he got comfort without responsibility, and I was done playing along. One night after I stopped buying his groceries, he stared into the fridge like it personally betrayed him and hit me with this wounded voice. "So what? I just don't eat," I told him. "You can buy food." He called me cruel. I called it reality, and I could feel my patience turning into something sharp. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I started noticing my own flaws more. Because stress doesn't just reveal other people, it reveals you too. I was passive-aggressive. I was petty. I'd make little comments designed to sting. I'd deliberately leave the living room when his friends came over, so the silence would make them uncomfortable. I'd slam a cabinet door sometimes just to let my anger have a sound. I'm not proud of any of it, but I'm also not going to pretend I was graceful, because I wasn't. I was a wounded animal trying to protect my space, and wounded animals are not polite. I went to work the next day like a zombie wearing a blazer, and if anyone had asked me a direct question about my personal life, I think I would have started crying in the hallway like a toddler. But office life doesn't care, so I just smiled through meetings and nodded and typed and pretended I wasn't boiling inside. By the time I got home, I had this weird calm, the kind that shows up right before you do something slightly unhinged. He was on the couch, relaxed, like nothing had happened, and that alone made me want to commit a minor crime. He tried to make small talk, like, "How was your day?" And I wanted to say, "Oh, I spent it mentally rewriting my whole relationship," but instead I told him, in the calmest voice I could manage, that I'd thought about it and I agreed to be roommates. His whole face changed with relief, like he'd been holding his breath and finally exhaled, and he reached out to hug me like we'd solved a puzzle together. I stepped back and said, "Roommates don't hug like that." And I watched confusion flicker across his face. And it was honestly the first satisfying moment I'd had in days. Petty? Yes. Needed? Also yes. I started with small things. Not because I'm strategic, but because big changes felt scary and I didn't want to admit how much power he'd had over my habits. So, I stopped making coffee for 2 in the mornings, and I made my own breakfast and left the kitchen the way I liked it. And when he wandered in and asked where his coffee was, I said, "I didn't make any for you," like it was normal. He laughed like it was a joke, but his eyes did that little annoyed squint, like he didn't love the punchline. At the grocery store, I bought my stuff, and I didn't buy his expensive snacks, and I didn't buy the specific drinks he liked. and I didn't buy the things he accidentally only ate. I came home and put my groceries away, and he opened the pantry and stared like a disappointed child, and he said, "You forgot my stuff." And I said, "I didn't forget, I just didn't buy it." He tried to act casual, like, "Wow, okay," but it was the kind of okay that means, "I'm going to punish you emotionally later." I felt guilty for approximately 2 minutes, because apparently my reflex is guilt. And then I remembered he'd told his friends he was brave for dumping me, and I felt the guilt evaporate. Next, I handled the phone plan, because it was the easiest line in the sand to draw. I told him I was taking him off my plan and he had a couple of weeks to transfer his number. And he said, "Seriously?" Like I'd threatened to cut off his oxygen. And I said, "It's just roommate stuff," with this fake sweet tone that even I could hear was mean. He didn't transfer it, of course, because he assumed I'd cave. And then his phone stopped working on data. And he came home furious because he'd been out with friends and couldn't use a rideshare app without internet. He had to stand outside a store and beg for their guest network, and he told me this like I should feel sorry for him, and I just stared and said, "That sounds inconvenient." That was the moment he started calling it punishment. He said I was punishing him for being honest, and I said, "I'm not punishing you, I'm just living like roommates." And he rolled his eyes like I was insane. The thing is, he wanted the benefits of a girlfriend without the accountability, and he thought he could label it roommates and still have access to my labor. And when I refused, suddenly I was cruel. He tried other angles too. He'd suddenly offer to cook, but he'd ask me what I wanted and then make something he liked. And when I didn't eat much, he'd accuse me of being dramatic. He'd clean in a loud, showy way, slamming cabinet doors like he was auditioning for sympathy. He'd sigh in the living room when I walked past, like a wounded hero. And yes, it worked sometimes, because I'm not immune to guilt. A week later, his friends started coming over less because the vibe was off. And he hated that. He liked being the funny guy in the room, the host, the one with the apartment and the girlfriend and the life. And now the apartment felt tense and he couldn't perform. One night, he tried to initiate sex like it was a reset button, like we could sleep together and then go back to the old dynamic. I told him no, and I said it without apologizing. And he looked at me like I'd slapped him. He called me petty. He called me bitter. And I said, "Roommates don't have sex," which made him explode because he realized I was taking the one thing he thought he could still access, my body and my care. The next morning, I went to work with my jaw clenched so hard I got a headache. And on my lunch break, I sat in my car and cried, not because I missed him, but because I couldn't believe I'd let it get this far. And I felt stupid, and I felt used, and I felt like I was 15 years old again trying to earn love by being useful. Yes, therapy would have been great here, but I was busy paying someone else's bills. There was also this whole weird social pressure layer, which nobody talks about, where people expect you to be reasonable no matter how unreasonable the situation is. Like, his friends clearly saw him as this charming, unlucky guy who needed support, and they saw me as the stable girlfriend who should naturally provide it. A couple of them would say things like, "He's going through a hard time," as if I wasn't also going through a hard time, except my hard time came with paying for someone else's. One time, after he'd complained about me cutting him off, one of his friends cornered me in the hallway of our building, smiling like we were buddies, and said, "You know he's really struggling, right?" And I just stared at him and said, "Then he should go struggle somewhere he pays rent." The guy looked offended, like I'd said a slur, and he muttered something about me being cold. And I watched him walk away thinking, it's so interesting how people call women cold when we stop being useful. I also got pressure from my own side, because my friends wanted to be supportive, but they also wanted a clean narrative. Like, they wanted me to say, "He's terrible and I'm leaving." And I couldn't, because I was still emotionally tangled. One friend told me, "Just kick him out." And I wanted to laugh, because eviction isn't like throwing a backpack out the door. It's your home and your safety and your peace. And when someone is already unstable, you worry about what they'll do when you push. Not because I thought he'd hurt me physically, but because emotional chaos is still scary, and he was the type to explode verbally and then claim you made him do it. I kept thinking about the lease too, like it was a shield, and then realizing it was more like a hostage note. It was in my name, which meant responsibility was in my name, and if anything went wrong, it would fall on me. That thought haunted me. If he damaged something, if he started ignoring bills, if he did something stupid, I'd be the one with my name on the paperwork. I started locking my important documents in a drawer, like he was a stranger, which is a terrible feeling when the stranger is in your kitchen. When the phone plan thing happened and he got stranded without data, he came home raging like it was my fault he didn't handle his own life. He yelled about how humiliating it was to stand outside a store trying to connect to guest internet, and I said, "It sounds like you should have transferred your plan." And he said, "You knew I'd forget," and I said, "I'm not your brain." He called me mean. He called me spiteful. He said, "I thought we were friends." And I said, "Friends don't make each other responsible for their adult tasks." That fight ended with him storming out and slamming the door so hard a picture frame shook. And I sat on my bed shaking, not because I was scared he'd come back and hurt me, but because the atmosphere felt unsafe, like the apartment had become a stage for his emotions, and I was trapped in the audience. I texted a friend that night and asked if I could crash at her place if I needed to, and she said yes immediately, and I cried with relief because having an exit plan is sometimes the only thing that keeps you sane. The next day, he acted like nothing happened, which is another thing that makes you feel crazy, because you're still rattled and they're making jokes. He asked if I wanted to watch a show that night, like we were still a couple, and I said no. And he rolled his eyes and said, "You're really going to do this?" And I said, "You're the one who wanted this." The way he kept forgetting that was almost impressive, like he genuinely believed he could rewrite reality by repeating his version louder. I started documenting things in my notes app, just little dates and incidents, not for court or anything, but for my own sanity, because I could already feel the gaslighting, the "I never said that," the "you're exaggerating," the "you're too sensitive," and I needed a record of my own life. Yes, that's sad. Also, yes, it helped. His birthday landed right in the middle of this mess, and it felt like a test, like the universe was watching to see if I'd relapse into being his girlfriend just because the calendar said I should. In previous years, I'd planned something, a dinner, a small gift, a sweet card, all those normal relationship things that feel like proof you care. This year, I got up, said happy birthday, and went to work like it was a Wednesday, because it was. I could tell he expected more, because he kept hovering around the kitchen like a cat waiting for food, and he made these little comments like, "I didn't make any plans, figured we'd do something," and I nodded and said, "Oh," like I didn't understand the implication. When I got home, he had 2 friends over, drinking the cheap beer he'd bought with his own money, and they were all sitting there looking at me like I was the villain in a group project. One of them asked me, in that careful, fake concerned tone, if I thought I was being a little harsh, like I was a teacher grading too strictly instead of a woman trying to reclaim her life. I asked what he'd told them, and they did this awkward pause, and one of them said, "He said you're being cold, like you're punishing him for being honest." I laughed, like a real laugh, because the audacity was almost impressive, and I said, "Tell me why being a roommate is cold when he's the one who asked for it." They didn't have an answer. Of course, because the answer was that he didn't want a roommate. He wanted a maid who also cried quietly when he was bored. After they left, he accused me of embarrassing him, and I told him he embarrassed himself when he dumped me and tried to keep my apartment as a perk. He said I was twisting things. He said I was dramatic. He said I didn't appreciate how hard it was for him to be honest. And I said, "Yeah, it must have been so hard to be honest while sitting on my couch." We started fighting in these ugly, circular ways, where he'd bring up my tone and I'd bring up my bank account. And neither of us was listening because we weren't fighting for understanding. We were fighting for control. I'd go to bed furious, and he'd stay up in the living room watching TV loudly. Like sound could prove he was still the main character. Financial reality started slapping him in the face more often, which he acted shocked by, like consequences were something that happened to other people. His car registration lapsed, and he got pulled over for something minor, and he ended up with a ticket and late fees. And he came home ranting about how unfair it was, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying, "It's not unfair. It's just expensive to be an adult alone." His insurance, without my plan, cost more. And he whined about it, and I just shrugged because I was tired of being his safety net. He tried selling stuff on an online marketplace app, and he kept making these dramatic announcements like, "Well, guess I'm selling my stuff now," like it was my fault he needed money. And he'd hold up a pair of shoes or a gadget like it was a sacrifice. He'd list things, get low offers, complain, relist, complain again, and I'd sit at my desk in the bedroom with my work laptop, listening to him talk to himself in the living room, and I'd feel this strange mix of irritation and pity. Not enough pity to pay, but enough to make me feel weird, which I hated. He called his parents more, and I heard pieces of those calls through the thin walls, and it was clear they were offering help only if he moved back home. And he'd refuse with this wounded pride, like going home would be admitting failure. Sometimes he'd hang up and punch the couch cushion, like the couch had betrayed him, and then he'd look at me like I was supposed to fix it. like my presence meant support was guaranteed. I started realizing how much of his independence had been performance even when we first met, because independence is easy when things are going well, but real independence is what you do when you're uncomfortable. He didn't know how to be uncomfortable without blaming someone else for it. A few weeks later, I found his laptop open on the kitchen table, and I didn't go digging through it like some movie villain, but the screen was literally right there, with emails up, and one was an interview invitation. Actually, two. He had turned down interviews, and not because he had other options, but because the jobs were beneath him. He'd responded to one with some polite excuse, but the vibe was clear. He didn't want to work somewhere he couldn't brag about. When I brought it up, he got defensive instantly, like a kid caught with a bad report card. He said those companies were small, that the roles weren't creative enough, that he wasn't going to waste his time. And I remember standing there holding a dish towel, staring at him, thinking, he wasted my time just fine. Though, he wasted my money. He wasted my trust. But his time was sacred. Something in me settled after that, like a verdict. Whatever guilt I still had, whatever doubt, whatever maybe I'm too harsh, it just died quietly. Because this wasn't a man struggling. This was a man choosing comfort over responsibility and expecting me to fund the choice. That night, I opened my lease documents and looked at the renewal date, and 8 months after he moved in, my lease renewal was 2 months away. That gave me roughly 8 weeks to get my act together without turning my home into a war zone. And I made a decision so simple it felt like breathing. I wasn't renewing. I was leaving. I was taking my life back, even if it meant moving into a smaller place and paying for movers and dealing with all the stress, because at least the stress would be mine. I started looking at listings in my lunch breaks, scrolling through photos of tiny apartments with sad beige walls, and instead of feeling depressed, I felt relief. Because beige walls don't talk back and they don't call you dramatic. I found a 1-bedroom closer to work, not fancy, but clean, and I scheduled a tour. The day I toured it, I texted him that I'd be late, and he replied with K, and I stared at that single letter and thought, wow, he really thinks he's the one withholding affection here. Men and their confidence, honestly. Seeing those interview emails on his screen was the moment my last bit of guilt finally ran out. I confronted him, and he tried to flip it on me immediately, saying I shouldn't be snooping. I told him I wasn't snooping, he left it open, and also maybe don't lie if you're leaving evidence on a kitchen table like a beginner. He tried to justify it by saying he needed the right opportunity, and I asked him what his right opportunity was. Exactly, because it looked like his right opportunity was my paycheck. He got quiet, and then he got angry, and he said I didn't respect his career, and I said, I respect effort, not fantasy. After that, I stopped trying to keep the peace. Because peace with someone like that isn't peace. It's compliance. I stopped cushioning my words. I stopped apologizing for having boundaries. And yes, that made the apartment louder. And yes, that made me feel guilty. Because I'm the type who feels guilty when other people are uncomfortable. Which is a personality flaw I'm actively trying to kill. He started leaving messes as a form of protest. Like he'd leave trash on the counter or leave his laundry in the hallway. And when I asked him to pick it up, he'd say, wow, bossy. And I'd stare at him and think, you're calling me bossy for asking you to clean your own mess. In my apartment, that I pay for, while you call me a roommate. The audacity was exhausting. There was one night where he invited friends over again without asking, and I came home from work, exhausted, and there were people in my living room, laughing loudly, drinking, and my ex was acting like the host. I stood in the doorway with my work bag, and nobody even noticed me for a second, because he was in the middle of telling a story. I felt invisible in my own home. I walked straight into my bedroom, closed the door, and I sat on the floor and cried quietly because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me overreact. Later, he knocked on my door and said I was being rude by hiding, and I opened the door and said, it's not hiding, it's escaping. And he looked offended like I'd insulted him. He said, they're my friends too. And I said, then go see them somewhere you pay rent. He called me cruel. I called him entitled. The fight escalated until he said, you're acting like I'm some kind of parasite. And I said, then stop acting like one. He stared at me like he couldn't believe I'd said it out loud. And then he did this thing where he laughed, like a bitter laugh, and he said, wow, there it is, like I'd proven I was secretly evil. He went back to the living room and started talking louder, and I went back to my room and put headphones on, and I sat there listening to music while my heart pounded, and I thought, I can't live like this. That night, I looked up what it would take to make someone leave, and it was exactly the kind of headache you never think about until you're living it. Even if his name wasn't on the lease, he'd been there long enough that I couldn't just snap my fingers and toss him out. I called the leasing office the next day, and they were blunt. They couldn't remove him for me, and at move-out, they just needed the unit empty. My name was the one they'd chase if it wasn't. So if he refused to go, my options were basically a real eviction process or staying stuck. I didn't want cops or court. I wanted him gone without turning my life into paperwork. That's when it clicked that the cleanest move was me not renewing and walking away from the whole setup. So his comfort finally had a deadline. The irony was brutal, because I hated that I had to leave my own apartment to reclaim my peace. But I also knew that staying would keep me trapped in the same power dynamic, where he could always claim it was our home. If I moved, I could make it mine again somewhere else, where my name wasn't tied to his mess. So I started planning quietly, like I was sneaking around, except the mission was just getting my own life back. And yes, I see the irony that I had to act secretive to escape someone who called me dramatic. The landlord's renewal notice showed up in the mail like a little paper bomb, polite and official, the kind of thing that looks harmless until you realize it controls your next year. It gave us about 60 days to confirm whether we were renewing, and I left it on the kitchen counter. Not as a trap exactly, but not as a trap either. I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to feel the timeline the way I'd been feeling it in my chest for months. He found it while I was in the bedroom working, and he walked in holding it with this casual confidence like, "Hey, renewal's here." And he smiled like we were a couple again, like we were making a joint decision. He said, "We should just renew, right?" And it wasn't a question so much as an assumption, and I felt that hot, familiar rage rise in my throat, because of course he assumed. He'd assumed my money, my labor, my space, my body, my patience, so why not assume my lease too? I swiveled in my desk chair and said calmly, "I'm not renewing." I said it in the same tone I use at work when I'm explaining a bug report, because if I let my voice sound emotional, he would have used it against me. His face changed so fast it was almost funny, like he went from relaxed to panicked in a blink. He said, "What do you mean you're not renewing?" And I said, "I mean, I'm moving, and I'm getting a smaller place for just me." He started talking in circles immediately like, "But where will I go? And that's not fair. And you can't just do that." And I stared at him and said, "The lease is in my name, so actually I can." I didn't say it with pride. I said it like a fact. He asked if the landlord could transfer the lease to him, and I said I could ask, and he latched onto that like it was salvation. I did ask the leasing office, and they were blunt. He'd have to qualify on his own. Income, screening, the whole thing, and he didn't. He went into this whole frantic planning mode, talking about how he could figure it out, how he could maybe cover it, how he'd definitely get work. And for a second, I saw the old version of him I'd liked, the one who sounded capable, and it made me sad in a dull way, because capability shouldn't require panic to activate. When I told him I had already toured another place, he snapped. He accused me of planning it behind his back, and I said, "You planned breaking up behind my back, remember?" And his eyes narrowed because he hated being reminded of his own choices. He said I was being calculated, and I wanted to laugh, because yes, of course I was calculated, because when you've been supporting someone, you eventually start doing math. He raised his voice, not screaming exactly, but loud enough to feel like a threat. He said I was leaving him without a roof, and I said, "I'm not your roof." He said, "You know I can't afford this on my own." And I said, "You should have thought about that before you tried to downgrade me to roommate while keeping my bank account." He went from anger to pleading in this messy, exhausting way. It was weirdly validating because it proved what I'd been suspecting. He didn't miss me, he missed the stability. He told me he'd made a mistake, that he'd been confused, that he'd been stressed, that he'd never meant to hurt me. And I stood there thinking, "You didn't mean to hurt me. You just didn't mind if I got hurt as long as you stayed comfortable." For the next few days, he started making calls, scrambling, asking friends about couches, asking coworkers from old jobs about openings, reaching out to people he hadn't talked to in years. He kept leaving the apartment to meet someone, and he'd come back looking more drained each time. Once he came back and sat on the floor in the hallway like he'd forgotten how chairs work, and he said quietly, "Nobody can take me." And listen, I'm not a monster, so that hit me in the chest a little, because even when someone uses you, seeing them desperate is still sad. But then he looked up at me and said, "So you're really doing this?" And the sadness turned into irritation again, because yes, I was doing this, and he was still acting like it was about him. He tried to get his parents to help without moving home, and I could hear those calls too. And his mom, I think, said something like, "If you can live there, you can live here." And he got quiet, and then he got angry. And he hung up and said, "They're trying to control me." I wanted to say, "Welcome to adulthood," but I didn't, because I was saving my energy for my own stress. My stress was logistical: packing, planning, signing paperwork, transferring utilities, doing all the boring parts of leaving. His stress was emotional theater: sighs, glares, guilt trips, little comments like, "Must be nice to just leave," like I was abandoning a cruise ship, not escaping a leak I'd been patching alone. About 3 weeks after I told him I was moving, with roughly 5 weeks left before move-out, he asked to talk, again, and he looked wrecked, like he'd finally run out of performance. He said he wanted to get back together, that he missed me, that he'd been wrong, that he'd felt lost and he'd taken me for granted. He even cried, which is something I hadn't seen him do much, and for a second I felt my old reflex kick in, the urge to comfort, to fix. Yes, I hate myself. But then I asked him very quietly when exactly he'd fallen back in love with me, and he hesitated. And that hesitation was louder than any confession, because if he couldn't name it, it wasn't love, it was fear. He tried to swear it wasn't about money, and I didn't even argue, because arguing would have been giving him a chance. I just said, "I don't want to be with someone who only values me when I'm leaving." He got defensive and said, "That's not fair." And I said, "Neither was asking me to be your roommate while still paying for your life." He called me cold. He called me unforgiving. He said I was giving up too easily. And I remember thinking, giving up? Like I was dropping a hobby? I'd spent months holding this relationship up like it was a shelf full of dishes, and he'd been shaking it and calling me dramatic for flinching. So I started packing, and he started spiraling, and the apartment filled with boxes and tension, and every day felt like a countdown. Some nights, he'd vanish to stay with a friend, and the apartment would be quiet in this relieved way, like the walls could breathe again. Other nights, he'd be there, sulking, making passive-aggressive comments about how I never cared, and I'd ignore him and keep taping boxes. Because there was something deeply satisfying about sealing my life shut and labeling it kitchen and bedroom, like I could sort my pain into categories. The week before the move, he tried one last time, sending me a long message while we were in the same apartment, which is insane behavior, by the way, but he did it anyway. He wrote this whole thing about how he'd always loved me, how he'd been scared, how he'd been depressed, how he'd been confused, and I read it sitting on the edge of my bed, and I didn't feel flattered. I felt tired, because his words were still about him, his feelings, his confusion, his needs, and there wasn't one line about what I'd carried. Not one. So I didn't respond, and that silence was my answer, and it made him furious, which I guess is fair, because when you're used to controlling someone with emotion, their silence feels like rebellion. It is. The packing phase deserves its own warning label, because packing while you're emotionally raw is like doing surgery on yourself with cardboard. Every item you touch reminds you of something, and you have to decide whether that memory is worth keeping. I'd wrap a mug in paper and remember a weekend trip, and then I'd get angry because I paid for that trip. I'd fold a blanket and remember movie nights, and then I'd remember him muting the TV to tell me he didn't love me. It was like my brain was trying to make sure I didn't romanticize the past while I was leaving it. He did this annoying thing where he acted like the boxes were a negotiation tactic. Like if he looked sad enough, I'd stop. He'd stand in the doorway watching me tape a box and say, "So you're really leaving?" Like it was a shocking new piece of information every day. I'd say, "Yes," and he'd sigh and say, "I can't believe you'd do this," and I'd think, "I can't believe you thought I wouldn't." At one point, he tried to bargain with chores. He started washing dishes more, cleaning the bathroom, taking out trash, doing all the stuff he should have been doing anyway, and he'd do it with this heavy, tragic energy, like he was proving his love through soap. He'd announce it too, like, "I cleaned the bathroom," and I'd say, "Okay," and he'd look offended because he wanted praise, and I refused to clap for someone cleaning the bathroom in a place they lived in for free. The bar is in hell. I'm not cheering. He also tried to guilt me by bringing up my own flaws, which was clever in a gross way. He'd say I was closed off, that I didn't communicate enough, that I'd been distant lately. And I'd stare at him and think, yes, I've been distant because I'm emotionally detaching from the man who tried to demote me to roommate. He'd say, "You don't fight for us?" And I'd think, "I fought for months. You just didn't notice because fighting looked like paying your bills." One night while I was packing books, he sat on the bed and asked me if I ever loved him. And the question hit me harder than I expected, because it was so manipulative and so vulnerable at the same time. I said yes, of course I loved him, and he said, "Then how can you leave?" And I said, "Because loving you doesn't mean losing myself." That made him quiet. And for a second, he looked like he actually understood. And then it vanished, and he went back to being angry, because understanding would require change, and change was work. I had a breakdown in my car one afternoon, grocery store parking lot of all places. I saw a couple arguing softly near their trunk, and it reminded me how normal relationship stress can be. That's when I realized mine had become abnormal. I cried with my forehead against the steering wheel, and I wasn't crying because I missed him. I was crying because I missed the version of me that didn't feel constantly on edge. I missed being relaxed in my own home. The day before the move, I went through the apartment and took photos. Not because I wanted a memory, but because my brain wanted evidence. Evidence of the condition I left it in. Evidence that I didn't destroy anything. Evidence that I was leaving clean. I hated how distrustful I'd become. But distrust is what happens when someone teaches you that you can be blamed for their mess. That night, I slept on a bare mattress because I'd already packed my bedding, and the apartment felt hollow, like it already knew I was gone. He wasn't there because he'd left again to stay with a friend, and the silence was almost eerie. I lay there staring at the ceiling, and I felt this strange grief. Not for him, but for the time I'd lost trying to be understanding. I promised myself quietly that I wouldn't make that mistake again, and then I fell asleep for the first time in weeks without waking up in a panic. That was the sign I needed. My body was already leaving before my boxes did. Moving day wasn't dramatic in a movie way, but it was dramatic in a normal people way, where your arms hurt and you're sweating and you're trying not to cry while strangers carry your furniture. I hired a small moving crew because I'm not trying to herniate myself for a symbolic moment. And they showed up early, cheerful, wearing work gloves like this was just another day. And for them it was. For me, it felt like stepping out of a room where I'd been holding my breath for a year. He wasn't there when the movers arrived, which I think was intentional. He'd cleared his things out the night before, and he came by early to grab the last box, drop his copy of the key on the counter, and leave without a speech. I took quick photos of the empty rooms not for drama, just for proof, and when I turned in my keys later, the office did a fast walkthrough and marked the unit as returned. While the movers carried my couch out, I stood in the doorway and looked at the living room, and my brain did this weird flashback thing, remembering us laughing there, remembering late nights, remembering how safe it used to feel. And then I remembered him muting the TV to tell me he didn't love me anymore, and the nostalgia turned sour instantly. When the truck was loaded, I went to the leasing office, handed in my keys, signed the final paperwork, and the woman at the desk smiled like I was graduating or something. She said, "Good luck," and I said, "Thanks." And I walked out into the parking lot with this shaky, floating feeling. I sat in my car and I breathed, and it was the first time in months my chest felt like it had room. My new apartment was smaller. 1 bedroom, plain, close to work. And when I unlocked the door for the first time, it smelled like fresh paint and emptiness. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by nothing, and instead of feeling lonely, I felt clean, like my life had been washed. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's the best word I have. And no, I'm not romanticizing moving. It still sucked. But emotionally, it was clean. The first week alone was weird, because my body kept expecting conflict. Like a dog that flinches even after you stop yelling. I'd hear a noise in the hallway and my brain would brace, waiting for a sigh, a complaint, a passive-aggressive comment. Nothing came. I'd open my fridge and see only my food, and I felt this little thrill. Like, wow, nobody's going to eat my leftovers and then act like I'm selfish for being annoyed. I'd do my laundry and nobody would dump their stuff in my basket. I'd go to bed and the room would be quiet, and the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt safe. Of course, I still had moments where I questioned myself because leaving doesn't instantly erase the way you were trained to feel guilty. I'd think, what if he really was depressed? What if he really was confused? What if I'm the villain in his story? Then I'd remember the interview emails he rejected because they were beneath him, and the guilt would vanish again. Depression is real. Confusion is real. But using someone and calling it honesty is also real. And he chose that. A couple of weeks after I moved, he texted me something short like, "Can we talk?" And my hand literally hovered over my phone like it wanted to respond out of habit. I stared at the screen and felt that old pull, the urge to smooth things over, to be kind, to be the bigger person. And then I thought about how being the bigger person had turned me into a bigger wallet. So I deleted the message and I put my phone down, and my heart raced like I'd just jumped off something high. Instead of jumping into some shiny new relationship, I did the boring, unsexy thing. I learned how to be alone in my own space again. The first night in my new place, I ate takeout straight from the container on the floor because my table hadn't arrived yet, and I kept waiting for someone to stomp around or ask me where their charger was. Nobody did. It was just quiet. Like real quiet. The kind that makes your ears ring if you're used to tension. I had this whole routine for a while where I'd get home, drop my keys on the counter, and just stand there for a minute like I was checking for danger. I'd catch myself doing the old habit, planning 2 portions, buying the extra snacks, checking someone else's schedule, and then I'd remember there was nobody to manage but me. It sounds simple, but it messed with my head at first. I kept feeling guilty for being comfortable. Like comfort was something I had to earn by suffering. Yes, I know how messed up that is. A couple of times I almost texted him back just to end the weird buzzing in my chest. Not because I wanted him, but because my brain wanted closure on a loop it was used to running. I'd open the message, stare at it, type a sentence, delete it, type another one, delete that too, and then I'd put my phone down and go wash dishes like a normal person. And honestly, that was the point. Normal. No dramatic conversations, no lectures, no bargaining, no, let's talk. Just me doing my life. I also stopped telling myself I had to be nice to prove I wasn't bitter. I can be kind and still be done. Those are not opposites. So I told my friends what happened without sugarcoating it, and I let them be mad on my behalf. I went on long walks, listened to dumb podcasts, and I slept like a rock for the first time in months. When I did get triggered, like when I saw a couple arguing in a parking lot and my stomach instantly tightened, I didn't pretend it was nothing. I just breathed through it and kept walking. And that cute, new man epilogue people love to tack onto stories? Yeah, no, this wasn't a rom-com. I wasn't out here finding my person 2 weeks later. I was finding myself, which is way less cute and way more work. I bought myself groceries without worrying if someone would complain. I paid my bills without resentment, and I started enjoying my own apartment like it was actually mine. One Saturday, I rearranged the living room 3 times for no reason other than I could. I donated old stuff, threw out random junk, and I swear I felt lighter with every trash bag. I even did that petty thing where I changed my emergency contact back to my own number for a while because I realized I'd set him as the default, like he was my safety plan. The bar is in hell, I know. And the craziest part? Nothing exploded. No one punished me. No one called me cold. My life didn't fall apart because I stopped being useful. Months later, a mutual friend mentioned he'd crashed at his parents' place for a while and picked up some random job. The people who called me cold? They stopped checking in once there was nothing left to benefit from. Funny how that works. I'm not turning this into a life lesson. I'm just telling you I'm done being the fix-it person. I pay my bills, I lock my door, and I breathe.